I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on another successful Ukrainian drone strike against a Russian refinery. We hear the latest news live from Georgia as protesters take on the pro-Russian government, and we interview Professor Eliot Cohen about Ukrainian and Western strategy in the full-scale invasion.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 1st of May, 2 years and 68 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, news editor at the Kyiv Independent Nate Ostiller, and Professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, whose last government job was Counsellor of the Department of State, Eliot Cohen. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi everybody. Thanks, David. Welcome, Nate. Welcome, Eliot. Okay, let's start in Russia. Russian oil refineries were set ablaze again last night after being struck by suspected Ukrainian drones. One of the regional governors there has said. So drones operated by Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the HUR, were said to have attacked the Ryazan oil refinery, that's about 150 km southeast of Moscow, and another refinery in Voronezh Oblast, that is the Russian oblast bordering Ukraine in the far northeast. Go as far north and east as you can in Ukraine, in the real Ukraine, including the bit that Russia's on, and go north from there, and that's the oblast there. So this comes from military intelligence sources in Ukraine speaking to the Kyiv Independent. The Russian Telegram news channel Astra confirmed the oil refinery in Ryazan had been hit. The governor there, Pavlo Malkov, said an inspection was ongoing and said there were no reports of fatalities. That facility, owned and run by Rosneft, refines nearly 6% of Russia's total refined crude. It has been a frequent target for Ukraine's air attacks. It was last hit on March the 13th. And last night's attack consisted of, we are told, 4 explosions heard around 2 a.m. local time, which started a large fire. Elsewhere on the front, our friends at the think tank ISW, Institute for the Study of War over in the US, they report that Russian forces did not make any confirmed advances in the Avdiivka area yesterday for the first time in several days. But Ukrainian sources said that there were several more attacks a little bit further south in the Bakhmut Chasiv Yar area. Ukraine's general staff put in their morning and evening updates yesterday said their force had repelled a total of 47 Russian attacks in the Avdiivka area and 57 around Bakhmut. That's a much higher number in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar than in recent days. Now, ISW say in their assessment, they say, quite correctly, I think, 1 day's worth of reporting is not sufficient to establish a pattern, but these numbers might suggest Russia is looking to maybe slow down the rate of attacks around Avdiivka, to recommit to offensive pushes around Chasiv Yar. We know that they're very keen to try and take Chasiv Yar before May the 9th, Russia's Victory Day parade, even though the area to the northwest of Avdiivka, that's where they've had limited tactical success. So it would make, on the one hand, sense to try and exploit that little salient they've got going there, but they are very keen to take I think Chasiv Yar is more significant in terms of the geography of the war than Avdiivka was, but also it confers a tactical advantage in terms of the ground by May the 9th. Now, next one, the death toll from yesterday's Russian missile attack on Odessa, risen to 6. Sorry, 2 days ago, the strike on Odessa 2 days ago, risen to 6. One of the injured people died in hospital. This comes from the mayor, Hennady Trukhanov, speaking earlier today. You'll still see images of that on social media. It's still highly likely, that was my assessment, that it was a cluster munition attack there, which is completely contrary to the Geneva Conventions, but go and seek out the images, you'll be able to see for yourself. And then also on the weapons, Russia is said to have ordered more and swifter delivery of weapons for the war. This comes from Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu speaking this morning. He didn't use the W word, of course, didn't say war. He stuck with the mental gymnastics of special military operation. But he said to maintain the required pace of the offensive, it is necessary to increase the volume and quality of weapons and military equipment supplied to the troops, primarily weapons. You can see why he's the brains of the outfit. You can also see why he's worried. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said this morning Russia had lost, well, they say 469,840 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. When we talk about casualties, of course, we're talking about killed, wounded, prisoners of war and missing. And as we always say, you need to take all figures with a pinch of salt. But over the years now, Ukraine does seem to be a bit more accurate, or quite a lot more accurate than Russia, but not outside the sort of usual tolerances you would expect. So when they come out with a number like that, plus or minus, I would say 2 to 5%. But we don't think they play fast and loose with the figures as the Kremlin does. Now that number, that includes over 1,000 casualties yesterday alone, over 7,000 tanks, 14,000 other armoured fighting vehicles, nearly 350 planes, over 300 helicopters, 26 ships and one submarine. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you think about it, and think about the war more broadly in the context of comments about stalemate. But what's happening in the sea, particularly regarding the grain deal and where the Black Sea Fleet is and how it can be used, it's very interesting to see that this war is much more than what's happening just on the land. And just finally for me, David, 5 underground bunker schools are going to be built in Zaporizhia Oblast. This comes from Governor Ivan Fedorov there. He says 3 schools will be built in the centre of Zaporizhia, the other 2 sort of elsewhere in the local area. No timescale for their completion. And you may remember Kyiv was the first Ukrainian city to open purpose-built subterranean schools, obviously designed to shield the children from Russian attacks. I'll say that last line again just because it deserves noting. They are building underground schools to withstand Russian attacks. I mean, that says everything that you need to know about the moral bar being employed by Moscow in this war. But I'll take a little pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis, let's go to you next. What have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, David. I'll come to the devolving situation in Georgia at the end, immediately before we turn to our first guest who's on the ground there. But turning to other significant political stories first. Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, of course, for US president, has doubled down on his warning that NATO members will be on their own unless they increase their defence spending if he wins a second term. He said his message to the military alliance was as follows: if you're not going to pay, then you're on your own. It follows his remarks earlier this year, where, of course, he said that Russia could do whatever the hell it wanted to NATO allies who didn't spend enough on collective defence. This recent line came in a wide-ranging interview with Time magazine, where Trump said he stood by the remarks. He didn't say whether he would end all US funding, but, to quote, "I wouldn't give unless Europe starts equalising. If Europe is not going to pay, why should we? They're much more greatly affected. We have an ocean in between us. They don't." Now, it won't reassure anyone in the alliance, suffice to say, that Trump's icy view of NATO has thawed, as some were speculating. As we've discussed, many countries are trying to work to Trump-proof defence spending to Ukraine, and within the European context were the worst to occur, and he reduced support for the alliance significantly. It is worth saying here that I think many people are, to a degree, and I say to a degree, sympathetic with some of Trump's remarks with regard to defence spending in Europe. I think it's fair to say that it has been too low for a sustained period given the crises that have developed. But I think where the critiques come in, is this the West way of going about trying to encourage change? Threats is one way, but when it's enabling an enemy who is attacking an innocent sovereign country, many would say that this is not the right way of going about it, to put it mildly. And furthermore to that, I think too that the only people who'll be rubbing their hands at these kind of remarks will be Russia. Others will get very upset, and it will make them even more hostile to the United States. And so I think that's the other element that plays into this. It'd be interesting to hear Eliot's points later on. The degree to which America's own reputation suffers as a response to this, as well as, of course, a stable global situation defensively, it favours America economically. So it's in its interest. It's not purely selflessness that the defence spending is there in the NATO context. But anyway, we've discussed that enough in the past, but I just think it's important to contextualise this in some of these discussions, because he is not wrong in some of the fundamentals here. Now, as an aside, his remarks on the Middle East were also interesting, saying that he would defend Israel if the country was attacked by Iran, but also criticising Benjamin Netanyahu's approach to its war against Hamas and the Israeli Prime Minister's failure to prevent the terror group's October the 7th attack. To quote Trump, it happened on his watch. And then he declined to rule out withholding US military aid to Israel to force an end to the conflict, but suggested that he didn't support the pursuit of a Palestinian state. There was a time when I thought the two-state solution could work. Now I think the two-state is going to be very, very tough. Now, for more on Trump's position and the Republican Party, I highly recommend last week's episode, day 789, where we were joined by Jonah Goldberg, ex-editor-in-chief of The Dispatch, where we examined the situation in Washington in far more detail. It was a very, very interesting discussion. We're very grateful to Jonah for making the time. We'll add a link in the show notes. Now, since we're on the US, an interesting side story is that a US citizen has pleaded guilty to conspiring to sell more than $250,000 worth of sensitive drone technology to Russia. That's coming out of the US Justice Department. Nikolai Grigorev, 36, pleaded guilty to exporting US-sourced dual-use electronics used in Russian military drones after more than 11,500 electronic components were uncovered at his residence, going to Russian companies. He faces up to 5 years in prison if found guilty. The Deputy Attorney General in New York said, and I quote, "The Justice Department will continue to hold accountable those who defy our sanctions and extort controls to support Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression in Ukraine, whether they're based in New York City or overseas." And they also said, the Justice Department, they're searching for 2 other people connected to the allegations. Now, on that subject of sanctions, as trailed on the podcast, members of the G7 have now vowed to reduce dependency on Russian nuclear energy supplies to create a, quote, diversified fuel supply chain free from Russian influence. That's what they put out in a joint statement yesterday, just after our broadcast. Despite Western efforts to detach itself from Russian energy supplies, of course, Moscow continues to dominate the global market supply of certain materials, such as enriched uranium, which supplies, I think it's around 30%, Russia, of enriched uranium to the EU and around 25% to the US, or at least before the war. I think that was around sort of early 22 time. There was a report out on this from the United Services Institute in March, which looked into that explicitly. So G7 countries are now committed to assisting other countries to diversify their fuel supply following the war. And this statement was timed to coincide with the US Senate approving legislation banning imports of that enriched uranium specifically, although of course this is broader than that, from Russia. Now, there's a couple of other stories turning to Moscow itself. Yet another senior Russian defense official has reportedly been questioned by the FSB in relation to the detention of one of his colleagues on bribery charges. So Ruslan Tsalikov is the number 3 in Moscow's defense ministry. These are senior figures. So that follows the Minister Sergei Shoigu, of course, and the chief of the defense staff, Valery Gerasimov. He was reportedly pulled in for questioning after the arrest of Timur Ivanov, that longtime ally we discussed last week. Mr. Ivanov, who saw the construction for Russia's military infrastructure projects, is accused of accepting very large bribes and will be kept in custody until at least the 23rd of June, after appearing in a district court last week. A number of defense ministers have already been questioned or detained following his arrest. Suffice to say, it's not the best look for the Kremlin, especially when corruption is one of their main attack lines against Kyiv. But evidently they think the matter is serious enough to warrant the questioning being in the public sphere. And last but certainly not least, David, the situation unfolding in Georgia, where, as the BBC report extensively today, riot police in Georgia have fired tear gas and water cannons to disperse crowds protesting against that bill seen by the opposition as targeting media freedoms at Russia's encouragement. Georgian MPs have given their initial backing to the foreign agent bill, despite the EU warning that it could harm Tbilisi's bid to join the bloc. Parliament is expecting to hold a second vote on the bill later today. We discussed some of the context behind this yesterday, so I would point listeners to that if you want a little bit more detail. And I know Nate will provide a fuller picture on the ground very shortly. But just one word on this. For many, this serves as another example of the Kremlin seeking to sow discord in foreign countries in order to distract and divide Europe at a precarious moment. It is also further evidence of Kyiv's argument, what is possible when a country is closer in proximity to Russian borders or indeed Russian annexed territory, because it enables disinformation and corruption, etc., to more readily be fed in, something that would, of course, have major ramifications for Europe if Russia were to seize effective control over large swathes of Ukraine. But I'll stop there, David, so we can hear from someone actually in Georgia.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Francis. Nate, thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to hear from you again. Can you just start maybe just by telling us where have you been and what have you seen over the last few days?
Sure, yeah. Thanks again for having me, and it's good to be back. So I've been to the protests a few times, and I was there yesterday right before it got violent, and I left, it appeared about 20 minutes or so before they started throwing tear gas and brought out the water cannons and so on. But I also want to point out that, and maybe you guys covered this yesterday, but the previous day there was a massive pro-government rally also in Tbilisi. And the estimates are, somewhere close to 100,000 people possibly. And this one was fascinating. I was there because they bussed in people from all over the country, many of whom were older people. And there were many reports from both people I've talked to and local media that there was some kind of combination of coercion, threats, like they would say, we'll pay for your transportation. And I saw this myself. They had these big bottles of wine that they were passing out to these older people that were there. And one of the things that's been spread on Georgian social media is that a lot of these people didn't even know why they were there. They're here at this rally in support of Georgian Dream, and they're not even sure what the rally is for.
Looking at the anti-Georgian Dream protesters then, can you tell us a little bit about who they are? Who makes up the majority of these protesters? What did they tell you? And what do they want?
Yeah, so there's definitely a huge difference in the demographics between just these past 2 days. I would say the majority of the anti-Georgian Dream protesters are young, though that's not to say there aren't plenty of older people there as well. And so during the protests, which from what I saw were the protesters were entirely peaceful, the things that they're chanting, I think, say a lot about what they want. They call the police and the government slaves. They repeat this over and over again, and they say no to the Russian law. And basically, they're opposed to this law because they understand correctly that if this law is passed, that effectively will shut down their options of joining the EU, which is something that the vast majority of Georgians are in favor of. And this is something that polling has borne out for a long time. This is not a new trend.
And Nate, do you have any sense of where this all goes? What happens now? We saw violence yesterday from the police towards the protesters. What's the atmosphere like today?
Yeah, so I was actually, just before this, I was talking to some local journalists, and I asked, what's the difference between the protests this year and the protests last year? Because as we know, eventually Georgian Dream effectively got scared and backed down, decided not to pass the law. This time, they seem pretty determined to get it through, despite the clear evidence that it's super unpopular. And another difference this year is that it's actually been more violent, and they've been singling out individual protesters in the demonstration for beatings and so on, including some opposition leaders like Levan Khabeshvili, who was beaten, lost some teeth, and he showed up in parliament today for the votes in a wheelchair. So from what I understand, basically the protesters are not scared and plan to go out again today and tomorrow, and as long as it takes. And just to add to this, the local journalists and Georgian experts who I've talked to, they think that if this law is passed, it will actually hurt Georgian Dream's chances in the upcoming elections in October.
Nate, when you're talking to people then at these protests and the experts and the journalists, how do they think of what's happening in Georgia in relation to what, of course, has been happening in Ukraine?
Right. So a lot of people that I've spoken to saw the beginning of the full-scale invasion as the turning point in which there was no longer a question, which side is Georgian Dream on? Because when this party was originally elected in 2012, they were pro-EU, and they even accomplished some pro-EU things, such as the visa liberalization. But now, after the beginning of the war, they've increasingly become more openly anti-West, anti-Ukraine, and that's pretty widely understood. Something that we've reported on at Kyiv Independent is how many Georgians have gone to fight in Ukraine against Russia. I think, as far as we know, the highest percentage of a population of foreign fighters comes from Georgia. And the Georgian people are broadly in favor of Ukraine and opposed to Russia. Of course, this is all complicated by various estimates. Maybe around 100,000 Russians have come here or are still here since the beginning of the full-scale war. There's anti-Russian graffiti all over Tbilisi, and it's a bit of a tense environment, I would say.
And this isn't supposed to be a trite question at all, but this is all playing out really in real time, isn't it? Which side would you say have the upper hand at the moment?
Between the protesters and Georgian Dream?
Yes, exactly.
It's really hard to say. It's to put it in perspective, Georgian Dream is not a particularly popular party. Recent polling suggests they have around 20 to 25% support. It doesn't help that the political opposition is also rather weak. But the general consensus from people that I've spoken to is that despite the current difficulties, they think that the opposition will win. Whatever form this takes, we don't know exactly what kind of coalition they might be able to make, but that's the consensus that I've heard.
Nate, is there anything we haven't said or haven't asked you that you think is important to mention just to help our listeners understand what's happening in Georgia? Yeah,
I think it's a really important front. And it's, as you mentioned earlier, for a while, this has been one of the most successful kind of Russian influence operations. They have effectively controlled this government without having to send in tanks as they did in Ukraine. And it's especially shocking when you consider that there was a war in 2008 and that Russia still occupies around 20% of Georgia. And yet, at the same time, this government is openly pushing pro-Russian policies. It's really shocking to see.
Well, Nate, thank you so much for your reporting there. We'll come back to you at the end for any further updates and for your final thoughts. But we're delighted now to welcome back to the podcast Professor Eliot Cohen, whose thoughts on military strategy and security will, of course, be well known to listeners from his columns in The Atlantic, but also, of course, from sharing a panel with us at the British Embassy in Washington on our trip last September. Eliot, your last government job was Counsellor of the Department of State, one of the most senior jobs in that department. You were taken to Iraq, Afghanistan and other places. Since then, you've been to Ukraine many times, including very recently. You wrote about this. Let's start there. What were your big takeaways?
Well, first, David, thank you for having me on. And as you know, I'm a great admirer of the podcast. I think one of the things that happens when you visit a country and see the same people over and over again is you get a sense of what their kind of baseline mood is. And I have been going back to Kyiv several times. What struck me in this last visit is that the senior leadership was clearly feeling the strain. Now, that was before the supplemental passed here, so I'm sure their mood improved with that. But I think there was a kind of a dark mood. And then in particular, one of the things that struck me is I didn't have the sense at that moment that they had a clear theory of victory for how they win this thing. I mean, they're holding on. Now, I think that makes sense. I mean, we're at a very difficult moment in the war. I personally think things will change, but that part of the mood was grim. And like I said, I hope it's better now that the supplemental has passed. But there was this, I would say, not fear of abandonment, but a profound frustration that the West has continued to deliver things in excessively small quantities and without a real sense of urgency. And I think they're right.
Just talking about the supplemental then, do you think the West has regained the initiative at this point? Or is it, as maybe you're implying, it's too little too late?
Well, I don't think it's too little too late. I think what it did is it temporarily restored some degree of confidence in the United States. I mean, I think that everybody's big fear, and it's actually reflected in some of your opening remarks, and particularly Francis's opening remarks, is, oh my God, what's happening to the United States? Because let's face it, if the United States does not take the lead in this, the Europeans don't seem to be up at the moment to deliver. So I think that's happened temporarily. The next big question is who's going to win the election in November, and that we won't know until it happens.
Looking at your experience of Ukrainian society then, there was one line I thought was really interesting in your Atlantic piece, in which you wrote, the Ukrainian war effort is both strengthened and weakened by the nature of Ukrainian society. Could you go into some detail about what you mean by that? I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Well, we had one of the people we spoke with was the Minister of Strategic Industries, who was a very impressive figure who had organized the railroads. And it's quite remarkable that the railroads are still running. There's a whole logistical side to this war, which I think does get underreported. And he talked about the horizontal nature of Ukrainian society, by which I think he meant the sort of self-organizing part of it. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Ukrainian drone program, but a lot of it was created by a very strange combination of hobbyists and investment bankers and technologists of different kinds, frequently working around a Ministry of Defense that they thought was rather stodgy. And what he said is, this is our national character, it's our national problem, and it's our national superpower. And I think that's right. And again, it's a theme that I think you've pointed to in the podcast. And also, as a friend of mine who was on this trip, Mick Ryan, who you've also had on the pod, says the Ukrainians are very good at innovating bottom up. The Russians are able to adapt to some extent top down. And I think that remains true. And we're at a phase in the war where the Ukrainians need a bit more top down. But the essence of the society remains that it is one where there'll be a lot of initiative from below. And that's not just an artifact, I think, of Ukrainian society since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. It's something that actually, I think, goes a lot further back in Ukrainian history and the Ukrainian national character.
Eliot, you mentioned finding a much darker mood amongst officials when you visited. Can I ask what else surprised you maybe about your trip? You've been there several times. Is there anything that's shocked you or made you look twice?
I wouldn't really say so. I mean, I continue to be struck when I go to Kyiv that what a beautiful city it is and the extent to which normal life goes on. I mean, their cafes are not absolutely full, but there are plenty of people in them. There's plenty of traffic on the roads, and then you have sirens at night. So I wouldn't quite call it full normalcy, but it's very different from what my first trip was like, which was in the spring of 2022, after the invasion had been successfully blocked. It is still a less tense city than it was. But I would say that is the main thing, that the Ukrainians, I think, perhaps had an idea that they would be able to not sew it up, but really achieve major successes earlier than this. And I think they are settling down to the reality that it's going to be a long, slogging war that'll go on for quite likely, if not for another year, perhaps for years.
Eliot, earlier we were speaking to Nate in Georgia, speaking about how that crisis there relates to what's happening in Ukraine. Would you like to sort of take up that theme as well and discuss this idea of the polycrisis? You know, how does, in your view, the war in Ukraine relate to topics like China, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and ISIS? I know this is something you've been thinking quite a bit about.
I have. The past year, I've been to Ukraine a couple of times. I was in Israel in December. I've also been to Taiwan and other parts of the Asia Pacific. So it's been an interesting experience looking at two war zones and one potential war zone. And there are a couple of things that really hit me about it. But one was we are, I think, unfortunately seeing a kind of oppositional coalition forming. It's a coalition, it's not an alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And I think in each of these conflicts, we can drill down into that if you wish, you see more and more cooperation. The thing that's most urgent right now, a report that just came out of my institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, documented the extent to which the Chinese have been upping their contributions to the Russian war effort, not with finished end items, but with different kinds of components and things like nitrocellulose, which you need for ammunition. And I think that's one big part of it. The second part of it, talking about the two active wars, Israel-Hamas and Russia-Ukraine, one thing that struck me in both cases, and is something you've talked about in the Ukrainian context, and that is the very deliberate, extensive use of sexual violence. And it again, I can drill down into that if you wish. It's horrific in both cases. And it reflects the nature of the opponents we're up against, who really have no compunctions about doing anything. And that is something that I think is not fully sunk in among a lot of Western publics. You're up against people who will use any kind of violence if they think it serves their purposes. And that really it changes the stakes of what we're up against. To some extent, may even change the kinds of things that you're willing to do in order to block it.
Well, let's take both of those ideas then. Let's start with China. You mentioned the increased cooperation between China and Russia and how, as we've reported, China is indeed sending more and more sort of bits of material that will aid the Russian war effort. A simple question here really is why, and also what's changed? Why now and not as it was maybe 2 years ago?
Well, I think the Chinese had a bit of ambivalence about this to begin with. They had economic ties to Ukraine. At least nominally, they've always been in favor of sovereignty. I think they were not particularly interested in a confrontation with the West, but I also think that they fully expected the Russians to wrap that up pretty quickly, as did, of course, a lot of people in the West as well. What I think has happened over time is, first, I think the Chinese may have some anxieties that the Russians would lose, which they don't want. Now, the Sino-Russian relationship is fraught in some ways, and I think the Chinese have a certain degree of contempt for Russian military performance, which is merited. But at the end of the day, they do, I think, view themselves as standing back to back, as it were, against the United States. And I don't think they want to see the Russians go down. I think they feel that would be very bad for them. We also have to remember that you're dealing with two aging autocrats in Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They both see themselves, so they've got the mortality is approaching. They both have absolute power and really no internal dissent or controls or limits of the kind that, say, Nikita Khrushchev would have had in the old days, or even some of the other Chinese leaders after Mao. And most importantly, both of them see themselves as having an extraordinary kind of historical mission before them of reuniting lost lands, establishing their rightful position in the world, and taking down not the rules-based international order, which is, I've always thought is not a very useful phrase, but the American constructed international order, because that's really what is at stake. It's the order that the United States and its critical allies, including, most importantly, I think Britain, in the wake of World War II, created, and which we've all benefited from enormously. And I think they really do want to take that down. I think there are echoes of this to some extent with Iran, but those are the two. And I think they do see a commonality of interest. The one thing which I would qualify that is I think there are certain things that the Chinese do not want to see. So they do not want to see the Russians use nuclear weapons. And the reason why they don't is because I think they understand full well that if that threshold is breached, then there will be countries on their periphery which will think, my goodness, anything is indeed possible. We can't really count on the United States to deter this. We need our own nuclear weapons. And so they don't want to look at a world with Japanese nuclear weapons, Korean nuclear weapons, maybe even Taiwanese, Australian, Indonesian nuclear weapons. But in other respects, I think they believe, at least at the moment, that their interests are aligned.
Thank you so much, Eliot. Just going back then to your point about sexual violence, do you think that as you've sketched out the lessons of the extensive use of sexual violence, that, as you said, it really does mean that your opponents are willing to go to any ends and use any sort of violence to achieve their goals? Do you think that lesson has been learnt in Western capitals? Are we learning the right lessons from that?
No, and shame on us. I mean, of course, during the Yugoslav civil wars, we saw plenty of examples of that, and people noted it at the time and then dropped it. And of course, as we think about the Soviet conquest of the eastern part of Germany, at the end of World War II, there was mass rape, on a scale which is difficult to imagine. And as we've talked about World War II, particularly in the East, we have tended to skip over that and not think about it too much, or to conceive of it as soldiers getting out of hand, which happens. Henry V, in Shakespeare's famous speech at Harfleur, threatens people with that, said, look, my soldiers will get out of control. But that's not what this is about. I mean, mass sexual violence is not about sex, obviously. It is about humiliation. It's about dominance. It's about intimidation. It's about terror. And that is really what is going on at the heart of it, that you have states, and you also have movements like ISIS, which we could talk about, which will use sexual violence as just one more thing that's in the toolkit to achieve their objectives.
Eliot, Francis, thank you so much for your time. It's always an honour to talk to you. Just staying on this theme, first of all, it's obviously something we've covered extensively on the podcast, but I'm interested to hear your perspective on why this has not cut through. I mean, one can speculate about that on various different angles, I suppose, but we talk all the time as part of our culture in the West, never again, particularly in the Holocaust situation and context. But why then is this something that is not being more readily discussed, do you think?
Well, I mean, just focus narrowly on sexual violence. First, it's revolting to think about, and the details are hideous, and you have to force yourself to look at them and to think about them, and nobody wants to do that. But I think beyond that, there are two other things. One is the implications of what I just said are unsettling. I mean, it might mean that really you do need to spend not 2.5% of GDP on defense by 2030, as the British Prime Minister has said, but maybe 3% or 4% or 5%. I mean, if you're facing that level of threat. And so people shrink from the thoughts they needs must think, as a poet once put it. But I think the other thing is we have a tendency to compartmentalize and to treat these different phenomena as separate phenomena. Well, that's that conflict and that's that conflict. And I think the analogy, and Francis, you and I have discussed this, it's a bit to the 1930s. And of course, others have made this analogy as well, where it's not that Western statesmen didn't get concerned about, say, the Italian invasion of what was then Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, in 1935, or Hitler's occupation of the Rhineland, or the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 in Manchuria, but they tended to compartmentalize them. Well, those are separate problems. And I think it does take a certain degree of big think in order to say we're up against a larger phenomenon here, and we have to think about it as such.
Thank you. It's an interesting perspective on that. Just changing subjects then to something else you spoke about earlier on. You alluded to Henry V, and it's this question of leadership, something that you're particularly focused on at the moment, having written a book on the subject of it. Something that is, of course, in the Ukraine context, particularly a problem, I think, for Ukraine at the moment, is something we've talked about, which is President Zelensky is, for obvious reasons, saying similar things now for the last 2 years, about the crisis that the Europe will face, that the West faces. And that messaging, whilst was very effective earlier on in the war, because he is saying the same things again and again, it doesn't got quite the same degree as cut through that it once did. I think that's fair to say. So as a consequence of that, if you were, as it were, advising President Zelensky, how do you think he can change message? What kind of things should he be saying? Or do you think actually it's out of his hands and he's in a really very difficult spot here?
Well, it is to some extent out of his hands. I mean, first, let's just recall what a brilliant job he did in the opening phase of the war. And I think we will look back on that in a decade or two and say, this is a case where an eloquent individual, by the way, with a consummate sense of theater, was able to change a mood, which in turn had real consequences for his nation, but also for the rest of us. So let's not diminish that achievement. I think the problem is you can only live at the peaks for so long. And I would invoke Churchill, those phenomenal speeches that he gives in the summer of 1940, that sort of rhetoric was not going to carry you through the entire war. It doesn't carry you through the Blitz. It carries you through the Blitz. It doesn't carry you through V1s and V2s raining down on London and all the rest. So there's a limit to that. The other thing is there's another dimension of leadership, which I think he is beginning to wrestle with, which is the one that's less visible to us. And that's the internal one of how he manages his generals, how he develops and runs the institutions that actually fight the war. And there's a lot of that stuff, as I said, would not be visible. I mean, part of the genius of a Churchill was he was actually very good at that. We tend to think about him in terms of the external rhetoric. I think the most important thing I would say if I were to advise President Zelensky, it's the Ukrainians they may have to forge this together with us, but there has to be some sort of broad view of why they think and why we think this thing can be won. Now, as I may say in my final thoughts, there are always going to be limits to that. You can't sketch it out in an enormous level of detail. But there has to be a theory of victory, however broad and well-defined. And I think the Ukrainians have not done that yet, and he has not done that. He has the rhetorical gifts to do that, and I think there's a case that can be constructed, but they need to take the lead on that. Otherwise, you'll get from the West empty rhetoric, in my view, like we'll be with the Ukraine as long as it takes. Well, that's a meaningless phrase. What you've got to be thinking about is how you win this thing. And I think that's what's really called for now is a theory of this is how we think this thing can be won.
Well, to put that to you, Eliot, I mean, this is obviously a really vital question. How do you think this war can be won? And as a corollary to that, you mentioned earlier on that this may well be a longer war lasting many more years than many expected. There have been examples of conflicts that have gone on for a long time, and it has led to total victory, as it were, even against Russia, like in the Soviet-Afghan war. Do you think that is the only way that Ukraine can win this now, as somebody put it to me at the conference around NATO last week? Or do you think that a shorter, swifter victory that avoids the bloodshed and the tragedy that will follow that is still possible?
Unfortunately, I don't think a short, swift victory is in the cards. I just think for a whole bunch of reasons, some having to do with the nature of the Ukrainian armed forces and what they can reasonably be expected to have, even with increased Western aid, terrain, weather, all that. The idea that you're going to have a 1940-style blitz or a 1944-style breakout from the Normandy beachheads that's just not going to happen. And in fact, I think one of our mistakes in advising the Ukrainians was during their counteroffensive, which didn't achieve nearly what they wanted and what we wanted, was we were thinking too much in those terms. I think it'll have several dimensions. One is the multiple campaigns that are going on. We get fixated on what's going on in the front lines, and it's very important, obviously. And that's in part because we can actually follow these things incredibly closely using commercial imagery and following Telegram accounts. And you guys are terrific at it, as are outfits like the Institute for the Study of War. There's the naval campaign in the Black Sea. There is a kind of deep strategic offensive campaign that the Russians are waging against Ukraine, and we need to be focused on that. But there's also one that the Ukrainians are waging against Russia. And then I think there's going to be more and more of a deep battle in occupied Ukraine. The Ukrainians are clearly investing a lot in developing a lot of effective long-range systems. We are finally giving them ATACMS. I think they desperately need ranged systems, some of which they will manufacture, but others of which we can help them manufacture. And there needs to be a better understanding of some of the weaknesses of Russian society. The Russians have been good at presenting themselves in a way as this kind of relentless juggernaut, maybe brutal, maybe stupid, but just unstoppable with limitless resources. And that's just not true. And every now and then you see the cracks in the system, as with Prigozhin, as with this latest terrorist attack, as with these latest arrests, which I think speak to what's going on inside the Kremlin. What it all boils down to is I think the next rhetorical challenge for Zelensky is to give people concrete hope. And again, I'll fall back on Churchill. And it's not just because I admire Churchill so enormously, but because Ukraine is in an existential struggle for extraordinary stakes, as was Britain during the war. And if you look at Churchill's wartime speeches, what you see is that he is explaining to the British people, to the British Empire, to the United States. And of course, a lot of his speeches were directed as much at the United States as at a domestic audience. So this is why we can win this thing. And that's really, I think, one of the critical things. So I think it is possible to put that together. I think that also makes the asks of the West a lot more kind of comprehensible and deeply thought through. I mean, there has, I think, been a bit of a tendency to say, okay, we want F-16s. We finally get F-16. We want ATACMS. And those things are all important. We desperately need 155 millimeter shells. All those things are absolutely true. But there needs to be a kind of a larger construct within which all this fits. By the way, one good sign, I think, is I believe that we are beginning to see something we should have seen long ago, and that is more Western and specifically American effort to help the Ukrainian military develop the kind of staffs and institutional structures it's going to need to fight this long war, including in the phases yet to come.
Eliot, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure listening to you. Let's move now to our final thoughts. We'll come to Eliot finally. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, thanks, David, and thank you, Eliot, and thank you, Nate, as well, for your perspective on the ground in Georgia. Today marks the 20-year anniversary when, on the 1st of May 2004, the EU gained 10 new member states, when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Cyprus joined. It was a momentous moment, symbolising for many the end of the Cold War and the shift west for many countries that formerly lived in the Soviet Union. Now, we have many listeners from and in those countries, so we welcome your memories and reflections on the significance of that moment. Reach out to us on Twitter or use the usual email address in the show notes. I have one thought to offer on this anniversary, which is that, of course, NATO also expanded enormously in that era. And one has to wonder whether, had that not happened, what the situation would be in Europe now, given Russia's renewed imperialist behaviour. Would it have attempted to seize back some of those countries via force or coercion, political manipulation, etc.? I think there is strong evidence now that would have been the case, and it shows the importance of safeguarding for the future, which is of course what Article 5 of NATO has done. And Eliot talked about Churchill today. I was quoting from him in his memoirs yesterday. Churchill talked a lot about that in the period after the Second World War, which was of course vital in setting up NATO. So indeed we are living in Churchill's world to a certain degree, and it may well have saved several European and now crucially perceived as European countries from Russian imperialism. But as I say, very much welcome listeners' perspectives on this.
Thank you, Francis. It sounds as if at some point you might want to do a bonus episode on Churchill as war leader, but I'll plant that thought in your head for the moment. Nate from Georgia. Nate, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, that's a good segue into the I would say, pretty pivotal moment that Georgia is in right now. I mean, the decades-long fight to join Europe, and it's all hanging in the balance at this exact moment. And at the same time, the government has been making steps towards increasing ties with China, and it's really putting into perspective, like, basically there are two paths in which Georgia can go. And at this exact moment, it's not exactly clear what the outcome is going to eventually be.
Well, Nate, thank you so much for joining us, and do stay safe. We'll be following your reporting from Georgia over the next days and weeks. Eliot, as our final guest, would you like the very final thoughts? And I don't know if you have prepared remarks, but we didn't get to the question on how Richard III helped illuminate Putin for you, but we'd love to know if you have time.
Well, first on Richard III and Putin, I was at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days before the invasion, and I was very struck that how many of my particularly European friends, some of whom very senior officials, just didn't really think that Putin was going to do this, or if he was going to do it, it would be measured and calculated. He might take a piece, or it was a bluff, or something like that. And I didn't really believe that. And the reason why is this book I just published, I was rereading Richard III for about the, 9th or 10th time. And what struck me about it is if you look in the first three acts of that play, Richard, who's committing murders left and right, is nonetheless doing it very adroitly and is covering his tracks. He keeps it all at arm's length, and he's very effective. In Act 4, he commits the big crime, the murder of his nephews in the tower, and there's a change. And what happens is he turns to Buckingham, his lieutenant, and says, I want the bastards dead and wish it done suddenly. Do you understand? And what that brought home is the filters had all come off. The need to be subtle, to be indirect, to be measured, to be limited had fallen away. And I think that's a natural trajectory for tyrants. And I think Shakespeare brought that home. So that's why I won't say that I was absolutely convinced that Putin was going to launch a full-scale invasion, but it's one of the reasons why I thought there's a better chance of it than other people. For a final thought, I would go back to something Francis was talking about Donald Trump. And as some of your listeners will know, I've been no friend of Donald Trump since 2015 and the before. But I will say that one of the things Europeans have to take seriously is, I wouldn't say that Donald Trump is former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates with bad manners. He's a lot infinitely worse than that. But what you are dealing with is a United States that periodically loses patience with Europe. I mean, think about it in the broad sweep of things. The United States intervened in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War to save Europe to some extent from itself. Now that we can argue about that, and I'm sure Francis would give me a rough time, but that's the way a lot of Americans look at it. And this is really the test for Europe to finally stand on its own feet or get close to that. And the United States will always have to exercise some sort of leadership. I fully acknowledge that. And that's why, like Francis, I've come to have an admiration for the current iteration of President Macron of France. Not, I don't know if there'll be another iteration, which I won't like, but I think he has some of the right ideas about potentially putting European forces into Ukraine. But above all, there is a crying need for Europe and European states to step up to the plate. And just in the British context, 2.5% of GDP on defense by 2030, that doesn't cut it.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. and you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.